once you bring a higher level of, predictability and design engineering, can you bring in new materials for structure, new materials for facade, and how do you use recycled materials and things that we probably don't intuitively think about now. And the best way to think about that is if you go back into the 70s, etc., all cars were made in like a metal-based car. Now they're all carbon fiber.
This is The Real Estate Interview, a series of in-depth conversations with those making a dent in the real estate business. I'm your host, Hitan Samtani. Today I have with me Dennis Hickey. He's the global COO and CEO of the Americas for Lendlease, which is one of the largest construction and development firms in the world. Lendlease's pipeline of more than $20 billion in U.S. projects includes an 850-unit development in Greenpoint at 1 Java Street, and a mixed-use project near Culver City in Los Angeles. They're doing a lot of interesting stuff in terms of pushing the boundaries of sustainability. We're going to talk a lot about that. We're also going to be chatting about what it means to be a 360-degree developer, someone who can handle both construction and design and development, and how that helps them navigate a lot of the challenges of developing in today's world. So Dennis, thank you so much for being with The Real Deal.
No worries. Thank you. Nice to be here.
The way that Lendlease is structured is probably where we should start. It was always known as this giant construction manager contractor, but now development has become such a key part of what you guys do. So can you talk about that evolution and how one maybe informed the other, played off each other?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. Lendlease was founded in Australia back in the early 60s. So we've been around for 70 years almost. And it was founded by a Dutch immigrant who migrated to Australia and really started a construction company. Which became very successful and then morphed into development work and then morphed into the finance area. And over a period of time, Dick Dusseldorp, who was the founder, really built a large Australian blue chip organisation that was very, very innovative. And so, we do all the elements of development, construction and investment as a house. And we've done that for decades, for many, many years. I think at the end of the day, the DNA of Lendlease is very socially driven, and that has really flowed through every decision we make as an organisation, really around what contribution do we put back into society, what's the legacy we leave behind, how do we treat our people, how are we doing more than just making the dollars. It really comes back to everything that the organisation does. Really, Lendlease has always been a developer and a builder. Yeah. However, in the US, for a long time, we were just a builder and we were not doing development work. I moved here in about 2014, and the board made a decision to increase the amount of development work we do and make the US business look very similar to what we do in the rest of the world. And so that's really been the evolution here, is taking the development skills we do very, very well around the world and bringing them into the US market. So what the US people have seen is a very strong construction company, which we still are, and we're still very tier one and a major player in all of the gateway cities. And now we're bringing that development capability and investment management capability to those markets as well.
And so let's talk, maybe just dive into one of your projects. One of the bigger ones is 1 Java Street in Greenpoint. That was initially bought by these sort of people who flew very close to the sun, Red Sky Capital. They were planning this giant, audacious project. Then they ended up having trouble across their portfolio. And you picked up 1 Java Street in Greenpoint, where I believe you're planning 850 odd units. Talk about that project. That's quite a substantial amount of new housing to be brought to that neighborhood. So what is, I know you filed for one phase of it at the moment, but what's the status of it now?
Yeah, look, we bought that project, mid 2020 in the kind of the storm of the pandemic when it first rolled out. We believe in New York City. We believe in big gateway markets. We believe that people are still going to want to live in these gateway cities. And so, the New York waterfront and that Greenpoint district has been on our radar screen for a long time. And we believe the site is really well located. So we made the investment, and so we're really happy with that. And we've been progressing through design development, since that time. And we're looking to, start early civil works come start of June, July this year. So we're kind of well progressed.
And you talked about one of the interesting things about this project. It's called it incorporates something called a living shoreline. And it's on the waterfront. Let's talk about this concept of a living shoreline, what it means for a project of this size, what the engineering complexities are, and why you chose to go ahead with this.
Yeah, well, what that means is that your shoreline, rather than having a hard revetment wall where your tidal shoreline moves up and down a hard revetment wall, you kind of bring the the shoreline into the water and allow the interface with the public areas to be more tidal and more interactive with the common space, such that any movement in sea levels or water levels can move up and down with your site. We did this in Boston at our Clipper Ship Wharf project in East Boston, and it won an enormous amount of awards, and it was really a benchmark for environmental solutions on shorelines. So we can bring in that same technology into the One Java site. It's a different waterfront than the Boston one, so that solution again will be having steps down into the water, having access down into the water, and as the water moves up and down, we actually make sure that we plant that, and we have a range of green solutions to treating water and making sure that access can evolve with the use of the site. It's more about making the projects embrace the water and being part of the water rather than putting up a barrier.
Okay.
We believe that you've got rising sea levels in some way, shape, or form. One solution is to build a barrier between yourself and the water, such that if the water comes up, there's a gateway and a barrier between you,
like a moat. That's
a moat.
Yeah.
So we believe that the better way to do that is to embrace the water, still build up that protection that if it rises, and if sea levels rise by X amount, we take that into account on all of our planning. We still have the natural barriers, but the interface with the water is seamless rather than harsh. It's about our purpose. And I think our purpose is really, we feel a great sense of accountability and responsibility and obligation around creating great places. And doing that, you need to do things in harmony with not only the environment, but also with the community in all aspects. And so sustainability, which is, as I said, not simply just environmental, but it's also cultural and community sustainability, is the key driver. And that really comes back to the places we create. And so we're always looking to push the envelope. What's the latest thinking? How do we actually create something that hasn't been done before? How do we actually make sure that when the people live here in 10, 20, 30 years' time, that the site evolves with them, and that the projects we create form a real connection with the community at all levels? So from a sustainability perspective, we've been on this journey for 30, 40 years in terms of environmental sustainability. And so we want to push the envelope when it comes to decarbonisation, when it comes to reducing Earth's temperatures, when it comes to reporting disclosure. We want to be at the forefront of trying to drive that change.
Has there been a shift, though? Has there been something that happened in the broader capital markets or the investor base that has asked for this? Because we've noticed a lot of people bringing this up recently, right? Sustainability, ESG has become the new OPM in a way.
Yeah, look, from our perspective, it's really been, it's been a recognition. So it's a reaffirmation of what we do as an organisation. So as I said, back in the 90s, the early 2000s, we were very big on pushing these developments. We built a development in Sydney back in early 2010, which was carbon neutral, right?
Yep.
Which is a decade before it's become really popular now. So we were really pushing the envelope on all aspects of this. What you're seeing in the marketplace now is that I think what you've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is that society is looking for corporations to take a lead in the solution rather than governments mandating a solution. And now what you're seeing is also investors. So you're seeing capital saying, well, I only want to partner with people who believe this as well. And I'm going to put my money and deploy my capital and partner with people who believe in contributing to a better solution for this planet and our communities.
Are we looking at also sort of cheaper debt for companies that are doing projects like this? Or I just won't touch a project unless it has some sort of significant, green initiative?
I think it's more of the latter at the moment. It's more about the access to capital than it is about the cost of capital. So, if you listen to whoever it is, whether it's Blackstone, whether it's Berkshire, whoever, I think they still desire similar returns, but they're looking to channel their capital investments to much more into people who are socially responsible.
As of now, there is no universally acknowledged standard for what constitutes environmental responsibility. So, we talk about ESG a lot. There's the GRESB standard. There is the MCSI standard. But a lot of these, Dennis, are for-profit standards developed by industry people. So there's an inherent conflict. So how do you make sure you're not just building to a standard that is self-serving? That's an important thing, because at the end of the day, we want to build projects that actually do something for the environment, not just do something for the, investors looking at the reports.
Yeah, for a long time, I think people's response to the sustainability movement was around compliance. People, in the development or construction and investment fraternity in real estate would say, well, what do I need to comply? And so it was not really driven as a proactive tool to shape business decisions. I think for someone like us, what we look at are two things. First of all, what are we going to do for impact of the community? So basically, what measurement are we going to impact by what we do? And second of all, what is any environmental solution or impact of environmental solutions going to do for us as a company, both economically? So that's how we think about it. So we introduced and rolled out an initiative called Net Zero for Lendlease, which is really looking to get to carbon neutrality by 2040. And
even that is a pretty loaded term right nowadays. Net zero, you've heard it from 100 different companies in real estate, but which are we looking at? Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3? They all come with very, very different challenges.
Well, the word net can often be misleading as well, because people say I'm net zero, but the way they get to net zero is to write a check or to do some financial offset.
Avoided emissions is another big, pretty problematic way to do it as well.
That's right. So the real thing is to get to absolute zero. And that's what we're targeting for, is how do you get to absolute zero? So the work that you produce and the buildings and whether they're new developments or existing developments are absolute zero to the environment. And that's our target. And that's on scope 1, 2, and 3. And we've set some ambitions on scopes 1, 2, and 3. And we have a very clear roadmap. We're already starting to see that initiative reduce, the consumption of concrete, in finding new ways to use less concrete. We're working with the concrete chain about how do you decarbonize concrete, for example. We're working with steel. And so, there's a lot of initiatives. Once we set those high benchmarks and those targets, then the accountability is on us to achieve those. And being listed and being, we're heavily scrutinized.
Yeah. And scope 3, that includes indirect. So anything that touches Lendlease's operations, you're looking to get to carbon neutrality by when? By 2040?
2040, yep.
Okay. And I think this would be interesting as well. One of the big ways to get there, and you alluded to it, is materials engineering, right? It has to be about not only where we build and how we build, but what we build with. And given your capacity as essentially a GC, as a construction manager as well, you guys have the opportunity to really get into that. So let's talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned the steel. I've seen some stuff about hybrid, which is that green steel. Are you having conversations with companies like that?
Yeah, we're having conversations with so many people. We've got over 40 people sitting in just purely our supply chain management, not doing any procurement, just working with supply chain and just sitting there. How do we R&D? How do we pioneer? How do we test? How do we kind of push the envelope, across the spectrum, whether that's through HVAC emissions, whether that's through the manufacturing of certain materials, whether it's around waste management, whether it's around energy consumption. So, we do a lot across that spectrum. I think, the crisis is sometimes a necessary driver for innovation. Mm-hmm. And I think, this is, the world is pretty, attuned now that we have a massive looming issue if we don't change and decarbonize our world. And I think that's going to be driving the innovation. We don't know all of those innovations today. That's why it's 2040. But we're committed to being part of the solution. So I think the world is really going down the renewable energy path, and that's part of the 1 and 2 scope, as you know. Mm-hmm. So that's a really big one. I think the other parts are around really structure materials, around the manufacturing, around concrete, around steel. We're doing a lot with cross-laminated timber at the moment. Where how do you use timber as a structural solution rather than heavy manufactured structures? And we think that's a very viable way. And there's a lot you can do with timber. And when you use a cross-laminated solution, not only is it a more of a natural growing resource. It's actually all very, very emissions friendly in terms of a livable building. So, there's a lot of things we can do there.
It's also beautiful, right? I think that's one of the next things is, you're slashing costs and stuff, but how do you make this an aesthetic appeal as well? Like if you have a cross-laminated timber building, it's going to look very different. It's going to stand out from the cookie cutter pack of projects out there.
Yeah, and we've done that. For example, in Barangaroo in Sydney, we built 2 commercial office buildings at the base of 3 million square feet of mixed-use development, and these sister office buildings are 6-7 stories in nature, and effectively all built out of CLT, and all of the structural timber is exposed within and externally to the building and clad behind glass, and it really looks stunning. And so it's just a very visual difference in terms of the structure solution to the outside. To the people who work in the building, the feedback's amazing because the energy and because all of the timber is visible, it becomes part of the workspace, and you kind of live and breathe. And the byproduct of that is you actually see investors wanting to buy those buildings, and so tenants are going to want to occupy those more, and investors want to own those buildings more. So it's actually creating more value right through the real estate chain if you do it correctly.
Right. And then there is one thing is to implement existing technologies and talk to people about what's out there right now. What can I use in my portfolio? The other side of it is obviously investing in stuff that we don't know is out there, right? If you're talking about a 2040 target, you're probably looking at the horizon. So how has Lendlease as a company made any significant investments in climate tech, in R&D of new materials and all of that?
Yeah, I was actually off site today talking with a whole range of like-minded people, parts of, externally and internally. And we're talking about that. I think the first stage of this is where can digitization play? And so we think that, artificial intelligence, digitization is going to be the way to get greater productivity, less waste from sites. We're going to become smarter in measuring the output of buildings, et cetera. So we've created a company called Podium. It's an internally owned company, which is really around, digitizing the development and construction space. And we're doing a lot of work on that area, globally, in Italy, in the US, in parts of Asia. And we see that as a real driver of change. Involved in that digitization will then be, what materials can now be used once you bring a higher level of, predictability and design engineering? Can you bring in new materials for structure, new materials for facade, and how do you use recycled materials and things that we probably don't intuitively think about now? And the best way to think about that is if you go back into the 70s, et cetera, all cars were made in like a metal-based car. Now they're all carbon fiber. And so they've kind of replaced. Whereas if you went back in the 70s, you say, no, cars from a safety perspective can't be made of plastic or these things, yet they are. And so we will see the same thing happen in the construction industry.
Well, even in New York, there's been, concern about how the city has gone from being a messy, colliding place where you had the wealthy and you had the middle class and you had sort of lower income people all existing in the same sphere. But then with projects maybe like Hudson Yards, it almost feels a little bit disconnected from the city. Some people would say that's one of the issues with Hudson Yards. It's kind of its own world, even though it's sitting right in Manhattan. So the idea is to try to avoid that feeling in any of these massive projects that can really change the skyline in all of these cities.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, you need scale to create a different solution. Coming to New York City and getting one corner of a city block, it's hard to change a streetscape or a precinct by just doing a building at a time. So you do need some scale to be able to change that, whether it's a Hudson Yards or whether it's a Atlantic Yards or whether it's the Bay Area in San Francisco. Some of those big projects give you the scale to try a difference. With some of the things we do globally, our European business is very much a leader in what we call urban regeneration and redevelopment of the public housing solutions in the UK. So, in places like Elephant and Castle, where we partnered with the city there and taken an old social housing precinct and basically redevelop that into a very mixed use, which has got now, again, that social housing, it's got affordable housing, it's got a mix, it's got retail. So I think there's a great opportunity in New York and parts of America to look at these previous precincts and say, how can we modernize these, not to take them to the high-end wealthy market, but to really redevelop these buildings and precincts that are kind of in some stages getting to the end of their life from a structure point of view. And how do we actually modernize those and create diverse blocks of communities that really, that's what you want. You want different people living in these communities, not just segregated communities based on some demographic.
From the capital market standpoint, from sort of the deal structuring standpoint, New York tends to be kind of the pioneer of many different things, right? When it's tried in New York and it works, you eventually see it play out in many markets. But from the conversations we're having and some of the stuff I've seen, when it comes to development of cutting edge stuff, it seems like New York is quite behind in terms of its approach to sustainability, in terms of its integration of the streetscape into a project and all. But you're the global developer, so I want to get your take on that. I do want to understand, where does New York stand? Like, is it status in its own mind as kind of the alpha development capital? Does it hold?
Well, the old, the New York being Manhattan is a concrete jungle, for example, and I think it is, it's a difficult place to develop. I mean, I look at our construction people here, and they're amazing. And so what we do in terms of building, whether it's 432 Park or 157, 57th Street, some of these buildings, they're remarkable. What our construction team and engineering teams can deliver here on very small parcels of land, and the solutions are remarkable. And the buildings are stunning, and they're a testament to really world leadership in terms of what can be done from a construction engineering. But it is very much a vertical solution city, and a lot of the other solutions around the world tend to happen in bigger, kind of more horizontal solutions, as I said before, whether it's a bigger precinct, because that's when you can get into the infrastructure that service precincts. And so to create some of the leading edge thinking around environmental solutions, energy solutions, living shorelines, whether it's other environmental techniques, you sometimes need a bigger footprint of land to be able to do that. And that's where other cities have probably been more innovative than New York City, simply from a scale point of view.
That makes sense. So in the 432 Park, for example, the innovation might be the tuned mass damper that you use, and the way that it is able to, in such a skinny lot, it's able to kind of keep residents from getting nauseous. But in a different community, you could do more with the street. You could do more with integrating. Okay, that's a good way to think.
So if you look at 432 Park or 157, they have a very small interface with the street, right? Yep. And so what you can do with the ground plane is limited. If you go into a bigger building where your ground plane is bigger, and you interface more of the street plane, and you can get public open space, and you can think about how you bring in other solutions around land usage, then they have a different solution. But some of the innovation on some of these other projects around how concrete is poured, what is the engineering solution, waste management, all of these sorts of things. New York lead the way in some of those areas of construction.
And do you think then the sort of that kind of innovation in New York would happen in the outer boroughs and places like you're doing in Greenpoint, or where you've got a little more land to play with?
Yeah, I do think. I think it's part of the evolution, and this is why I like. Lendlease is very much we're an integrated company. We turn over $15 billion a year in construction. We've got a development book globally over $100 billion. We manage over $40 billion of other investment from other people. And I think when you put all of that together as an organization, the learnings you get from each part of that value chain is circular. And so what we do is the learnings we get from doing the high density in New York, for example, we can take those learnings into other cities, and whether it's into London or currently it's into Sydney. We're building a new steel structure building in Circular Quay in Sydney, and it's really picked up on a lot of the learnings that we've had here in New York City and Chicago. And so we've exported that knowledge into those markets. And likewise, we'll bring other markets into their learnings.
The pandemic, really brought some of that to light. I wonder how you're thinking about the hard hats and the construction unions behind so many of your projects, because you've been doing this a long time in many markets, right? Lendlease has been doing this a long time, but with a lot of new technology coming in, with software to in some cases replace a lot of workers or reskill them, I wonder there's been this. Let me know if you disagree, but a little bit of a turning point in terms of construction tech coming in the last couple of years. How is that sort of altering the landscape for the trades?
Yeah, I think we're kind of at the early stages of construction tech coming through and really changing the methodology from, say, traditional construction to assembly. I think that's still got a pathway to go. I think where technologies come into how do we get greater insights to make their work easier, safer, faster, and more effective. So, let's start with safety. So Lendlease, one of the core principles of us is that every person has the right to go home at night time to their families. So safety is the number one objective for Lendlease as an organisation. And so for years, we've been trying to work with all of our stakeholders to drive innovation around safety. So we were the first people to introduce screens into the New York market, because we used in other markets, working with steel construction and putting horizontal safety nets. So there was a whole, just as an example, so there's a whole range of innovation you drive, and you work with the hard hats or the contracting fraternity. And when you take the time to work with them and explain to them and demonstrate the value that can be gained, they're amazing and supportive, and they come with you on the journey. If it's a policing environment, just telling people what to do because that's what you want to do, then there's great resistance, and that's no different than probably dealing with your parents or your kids at home.
But what about new methods that will evolve over time in terms of, you might not need as many people on a job site when a job site is partially automated? How are you thinking about that? Because again, you guys are in this for the long game. Your portfolios are looking at projects that are even 10, 20 years out.
Well, I think everybody needs to evolve. And I think at the end of the day, there are some sites, if you went back many years ago, all of the formwork and structure here used to be timber. And it's moved now to much more of a modular-based system. So I think at the end of the day, a lot of the union solutions need to work with the industry. You can't kind of hold back innovation. We can't uninvent things. And so once that innovation comes through, it's about working collaboratively with the trade base and the subcontractor base and the unions to say, how do we create more opportunity and give people more visibility? And that may be having less people, in, let's say, a decade's time, instead of having 50 people on a pour deck, we've got 20 people on a pour deck because we've got innovation. I think it's about working with that and then saying, well, okay, well, then how can we do more projects with you, or how do we do more volume? And so it's a trade-off, but that efficiency will happen, and it's about working in collaboration with the trade bases and the unions.